Hello everyone, and thank you once again for joining me here at The Joy of Carving. In today's video, I want to take you through how you can whittle these miniature woodland mushrooms. And the idea for these came about because I was thinking to myself, if I was a complete novice whittler, carver, and if I had no prior experience woodcarving, what would be the most simple, straightforward thing that I could carve? But it had to be something that I would get a lot of experience out of carving as well. And these mushrooms really sprang to mind. They're simple shapes, and because we're carving in the round here, it's going to give us a really good experience in how to actually form something that's in the round that's a three-dimensional shape. They're really quick to do as well, so for a beginner whittler, there's almost an instant gratification because they really don't take up much time to do. With that said, pour yourself a cup of tea or a coffee and let's begin the joy of carving. As with many of the whittling projects on the channel, we don't need very many components to get started. So I have all of the cutouts of my mushroom pieces here, which I'll go through in detail later, and of course my whittling knife. All of the mushroom pieces have been cut out of basswood. The great thing about these mushrooms is they don't need to be perfect. In fact, the more imperfect they are, the better. The only real key for cutting out the wood for your mushrooms is ensuring that the grain of the wood is flowing vertically. And we'll begin as we always do, just by rounding all of those harsh edges. Now the top of the mushroom, the actual dome, is really straightforward. If you just imagine if you were sharpening a stick or a pencil, we're just shaping it into that point. Which is why it was so important to have that wood grain flowing vertically, which I'm pointing out there. Because it makes carving this piece a lot more straightforward. Because we're just going to be using the same technique throughout. Even the stem is going to be carved in exactly the same way. If you haven't got the wood grain flowing vertically on yours, it's not a major issue. The only thing that you need to be really cautious of is when you're carving the ends, the edges of the mushroom. Because what can happen is that wood grain is stacked. So as you're slicing towards the end and you get to the last layer, you can have pieces of the wood that will fracture and split away, which we want to avoid. The most difficult part of whittling this mushroom is the underside of the mushroom, which I'm carving there. The reason for this is we're going across the grain, which isn't a problem at all. You can do that. But the only thing that you need to do is ensure that your whittling knife is very sharp. It's a fresh blade, which I have to admit, I hadn't sharpened mine after the last project. So it's a little bit blunt, it struggled a little bit on this part. I should have stopped to sharpen it, admittedly, but I was too excited about recording this video. So yeah, just be mindful about going across the grain. It will feel a little bit more, it'll just be more difficult to carve. There'll be a little bit more resistance when you're carving. And there's the finished dome of the mushroom, the head of the mushroom. So we're going to move on to the stalk now, and we're going to use the exact same technique that we used for carving the head of the mushroom. So just imagine that we're sharpening a pencil, and we're just moving with the grain, and we're carving it into a point. You'll notice as I'm carving this that every now and again I switch the angle and I press the edge of the knife into the stalk, the tip of the stalk where it meets the head of the mushroom, like I'm doing here. And that just creates a stop cut, so it creates a point where all those feathered edges can end and we get a smooth cut, so we're not having to pull and tear those pieces off. And there's our first mushroom complete. We're going to use the same techniques now to carve the much smaller mushrooms. Because these pieces are going to be so small, I would recommend that you protect your hands or your fingers, so I would recommend you wear thumb sheath or gloves to protect your hands. We're continuing with rounding all of those sharp edges, making sure they're nice and smooth. And as I said previously, just make sure that your knife is nice and sharp for those bits of wood that are at the end grain. And now I'm proceeding to carve the edges of that mushroom, so I'm making it into a much more circular shape by carving the corners. And as you're whittling the corners into a nice round shape, just make sure that you continue whittling the dome of it as well, so just making sure that you're keeping all of those edges nice and round. Once you've carved that, you can repeat that process for however many mushrooms you like. So I've got 3 small mushrooms and 2 medium-sized mushrooms. And what I'm going to do now is carve a much larger mushroom, which will be the sort of centerpiece of the carving. But because that mushroom will be much bigger, I'm going to carve it in 2 pieces. Those 2 separate pieces are the dome and the stalk. So for the stalk, I've ensured that the flow of the wood grain is vertical, and for the dome, the flow of the wood grain is horizontal. Now, carving a circle like this may look really straightforward, but actually, because the flow of the wood grain changes so much, it's a really good experience for a complete novice, for a beginner, because you can't just carve in one direction the whole way around. You'll see as I'm carving this that I'm constantly switching the angle that I'm working at. The best way to visualize it is to separate the circle out into equal quarters, and every quarter you'll need to change the angle, the direction in which you're carving. And this is a fantastic experience for a beginner because it really forces you to feel how that wood grain is moving as you carve it. Are you moving against the grain or are you moving with it? Is it starting to tear and pull instead of carve? Do I need to change direction? So it really makes you think about the direction in which you're carving. Also, remember to just be really mindful about the proximity of that knife to your hands, especially with the hand that you're holding it with. Don't forget how close the blade is to your hands. And voila, there's the finished dome. And now we can proceed with carving that stalk. So you can see there that the flow of the grain is vertical. Because I'm whittling towards myself, I'm just sticking my thumb sheath back on there to protect my thumb. If you don't want to use the technique where you're carving towards yourself like I am here, then you can reverse it and you'll just carve away from yourself. I just find it a lot more comfortable, especially for these particular sort of carvings when it's something this small. I just find it more comfortable to carve towards myself. The key with this particular grip, carving towards yourself, is to hold the knife towards the top of your palm. So what you're doing is you're just squeezing your hand. That's all the movement is. That squeeze of your hand is enough to carve a small piece, so it's not a whole arm movement. And there's the finished stalk. So all we need to do now is glue those pieces together, glue our little mushrooms to our piece of driftwood, and we're done. And there's our little woodland mushroom scene. I think this makes a wonderful project for someone who has never whittled before but really wants to get started. The shapes aren't overly complex. You can carve a multitude of these in one day, but you get an awful lot of experience by carving these. So I do hope that video was really useful for you. Once again, thank you for joining me here at The Joy of Carving. Thank you for letting me take you through this project. Until next time, happy carvings.